From Flourish DX, this is the Psych Health and Safety Podcast. With workplace mental health becoming a safety prerogative, this is the source of information on psychological injury prevention and health promotion.
Hi, and welcome to the Psych Health and Safety Podcast. My name is Jason Van Schie, and I'm one of the hosts of the show. The aim of the podcast is to rapidly increase the knowledge and application of psychological health and safety in workplaces worldwide. To help with this, we have regular guests from around the world who are leading the way in this important area. But before I introduce our guest and topic for today, allow me to introduce my co-host, Joelle Mitchell. How are you today, Joelle?
I was reflecting on this morning.
Okay, great. Did some prep for once?
For once.
Look, okay, you prep every single episode. I just turn up.
Yeah.
So, okay.
So I like the Discworld books.
Yes.
And there's like this, I guess it's classified as a curse that says, may you live in interesting times.
Mm-hmm.
I think this timeline is bollocks, and if we could maybe switch over to the appropriate timeline, that would be better.
Yeah, I agree. I actually just saw a Jimmy Reese video last night, and there was a guy who woke up out of a coma who had been in a coma since 2016.
Yeah, that was the turning point.
And had to explain all these things that had happened.
Yep. How everything got terrible.
Yeah, 10 years, man. It's been a rough 10 years.
Sure has.
And somehow we started a business and built it. And
yeah, a business based on the fact that people are really miserable and we're trying to make them less miserable.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's, I agree. I'd prefer to go to a much more pleasant timeline. Yeah, absolutely. It's particularly, we record this whilst the war in Iran is still going on.
Yes.
It probably will still be going on by the time this goes to air.
Most likely, yeah.
All right. Petrol prices might be $4 a litre though by the time this airs.
Yeah, I might have an EV by then as well.
That sounds like a very pragmatic choice in these times.
Yeah.
Yeah, nice.
We do the best that we can in the situation that's at hand.
Yeah, yeah. Brendan is definitely gloating over the fact that he made the decision to purchase an EV a few months back.
Yep.
Yeah. Anyway, this is not a car show
No.
or a show about...
Or a current affairs show.
Or current affairs.
Yeah.
We could do a mean current affairs show. I mean, I would have to start watching the news, which would mean more prep time.
That would be a huge bummer. Imagine that, like having to
watch the news.
You know, just like reading the headlines is bad enough.
Let's just stick on LinkedIn.
Yeah.
It's depressing. That's probably the level of depression that we want.
I mean, even that. Ugh.
Mm.
Yeah.
But who'll do all like the, putting people on the right track, correcting if you're not on LinkedIn, Joel?
This is true. Where there'll be a dearth of witty, sarcastic takedowns.
I know.
Yeah. I just have to keep soldiering on, Jason.
Yeah, for the good of the people.
I've got to take the hit.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We appreciate you.
Thank you.
All right. We should introduce our guest.
Sure.
Sorry to our guest. He is a returning guest, so he knows what we're like.
He knows.
He first appeared in episode 86 way back in March 2022, so hit the 4-year anniversary just recently. He is an interdisciplinary researcher and emergency manager who works and researches at the intersection of moral injury, trauma exposure, and psychosocial risk mitigation. He has served as a sworn police officer, professional firefighter, and ambulance chaplain. He is director of the New South Wales ACT Disaster Recovery Chaplaincy Network at Charles Sturt University. A warm welcome back to the podcast, Mark Layson.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Jason and Joelle. It's lovely to be back.
We're calling you Doctor now, aren't we, Mark?
Dr. Reverend?
Dr. Reverend?
Reverend Doctor is the official title, but I hold that pretty loosely. In the 1990s in Sydney, there was a morning DJ, the Reverend Dr. Doug Mulray, who was definitely not a doctor, and he was definitely not Reverend. Anyone who was in Sydney at the time will remember him. So that was the only Reverend Doctor I knew growing up, a breakfast DJ.
Yeah, he was the original Kyle Sandilands, wasn't he?
Speaking of current affairs.
Yes, he actually got pulled off the television live on air by Kerry Packer. When he did a show. Interesting.
There you go. All right, over to Joelle.
Over to me. What podcasts are you listening to at the moment, Mark?
There's a few. I'm still into revisionist history when new episodes drop, and they do from time to time. One I've been drawn into, and I just started just the other day, is one called Uncommon Ground. And it's done by a guy in the UK called Justin Briley. And he sort of examines faith and secular context. But the reason I really like this is he gets two people with completely opposing views to speak about their views with respect for the other. And they start each episode where each person has to describe and explain better than the other person could what their position is. So the first episode was the former Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams, and it was his counterpart was Richard Dawkins, and they had to explain each other's positions and then engage cordially in a conversation. I think it's a fascinating little piece of way to get people to interact, and what I think in these divided times we're missing, the ability to be able to understand
Perspective taking, yeah.
to understand other people's positions and have a little bit of empathy.
Oh, good tip. And what have you been up to for the last 4 years since our listeners last heard from you?
A few things. So finished a PhD.
Oh, that's nothing much.
that was fun. I was glad to have that done. Recovered from having doing a PhD.
Yes, congratulations, listeners. That was heavy sarcasm from me. I certainly don't think a PhD is nothing much.
And recovered from all that fun that he had doing the
all
PhD.
the fun, yes, yes.
I tell you what, if there's a industry that is crying out for a psychosocial, risk mitigation framework, it's academia. There's a great paper that says that by the time people are in their fifth year, if they're doing it part-time with a PhD, antidepressant usage goes up 40%.
Only?
And the most recent psychosocial climate report by Maureen Dollard into the universities is a dire read. So it does take a while to recover. So I've done that. I've started in the directorship of this role, parachuting chaplains into cyclones and fires and things like that. And I've also been writing a book. I finished writing a book. It's just come out. It's Unexpected Poison, Betrayal and Moral Injury in the Workplace. And it's taking a really granular level look at work. The first section about why we find work so important. We hate it and we love it. We need it. It's really core to our identity and the way we make sense of our world. Then what it looks like to be betrayed, and thinking about some of those core themes that people perceive as betrayal. And a lot of them are actually psychosocial hazards. Is a good way of operationalizing that. And then thinking, well, how do we make work better? How do we stop that from happening? And how do we construct something positive to be at? So that's been really fun to be involved in writing the first book.
Yeah, congratulations.
Yes, there are many big achievements in the last 4 years, Mark. Are you exhausted?
I have been, but I think now I'm feeling energised.
Good.
I turned 55 this week, and it's either a choice of going into an over 55s village or just pushing on, and I'm really feeling like I'm just getting going. So I'm feeling really quite energised and enjoying what I'm doing and just fascinated by digging deep into these things.
Wonderful.
Yeah, and lots of sharing. You're heading over to the UK on Thursday, you said as well.
Yeah, so there's a moral injury conference over there that I was at a couple of years ago, and so presenting on psychosocial risk, moral injury as a psychosocial risk, and going, yes, we can see it in clinical ways, we can see it in pastoral ways, but we also need to see it in a workplace lens. And we're going to have a panel discussion on the pros and cons of moral injury being in the DSM. And part of it is, yeah, that's great, but let's have a look at it as a workplace harm as well.
Nice one. So, Mark, you joined us today to talk about organisational justice following a recent industrial relations hearing in New South Wales. So, what can you tell us about the hearing?
Yeah, okay. There was an incident. For me, actually, it was a personal story. I was sitting talking with a very dear old friend who's a teacher, and they got investigated. And they were telling me how difficult that process was. And lo and behold, that night I was sitting and reading, and a finding from the New South Wales Industrial Relations Commission there was about New South Wales Department of Education that had been given improvement notices about the length of investigations. They had appealed that. They appealed it to within Safe Work New South Wales, and it got the improvement notice got upheld, and they appealed it to the Industrial Relations Commission, and the improvement notices got upheld. So, Department of Education investigated a person for some issues that were in between, kind of childish. They walked around a playground with someone's face on a dartboard, so workplace harassment, and a few other things different like that. But it took them about a year to settle this complaint, and 6 months into it, a complaint was made to the Department of Education about the process that was going on, about the communication, about the procedural fairness of what was going on. And lots of really important detail was found in the report that was done by the Industrial Relations Commission. And in that, you can see in some ways, the special pleading that the Department of Education gave as to why this shouldn't be the case. They shouldn't have been infringed. But ultimately it was upheld. You can also see a really good timeline of the things that happened. And there's really some interesting hints once you start to dig a bit deeper and wider of some things that really show where organisational justice was the issue. And that was found to be overlapping with a role clarity issue as well, that Department of Education needed to improve.
Yeah, so when did this case start, Mark? If we think about the time frame.
Yeah, all right. So the time frame was that the person was told that there was an investigation against them and removed from their duties in April of 2003.
Oh, wow.
They were informed of what the allegations were 3 months later in July.
So did you mean 2023, not 2003?
Oh, sorry, 2023.
Yeah, just a couple of decades off. I was like, this is a really long-standing historical issue. Yes. No, I didn't think it was that long. Yeah.
No, so sorry, 2023. And so 2023, they get told they're under investigation. They get removed from their post and put into alternate duties that were ultimately beneath their training and their expertise. It wasn't that the person actually attempted suicide that night. And it wasn't until 3 months later that they got told what the allegations were. And by November, they made a complaint to Safe Work New South Wales. In March 2024, so it was 11 months later, they actually upheld some of the complaints against this particular person. But in February, so only 3 months after the complaint was received, Safe Work had handed down the answer to its investigation. So what you had was, over that 11 months, Safe Work had been able to commence and complete an investigation into the background, and it was completed within 3 months. And yet the actual result got to the person a month and a half after Safe Work had completed its work.
Yeah. So, investigations are something I know a lot of organisations are grappling with, particularly now that, there is a requirement to really consolidate how HR and safety do investigations and try and minimise the overlap and try and do cohesive types of approaches. So I think, there'll be a lot of listeners that are keen for us to unpack this further, particularly in, the thinking about this through an organisational justice lens. And we did touch on this earlier this year with a couple of gents from the NHS who've done some interesting research and have their own book, what is it, Under Investigation, is what it's called. So, I think there'll be some good parallels, but we'll dig deeper on the organisational justice side with you today.
Yeah, so let's have a look specifically at like how organisational justice comes into it. So maybe if we start with the investigation and the findings, kind of where is the thread of org justice through that?
Largely it has to do with procedural justice. And I think it's interesting in the different codes of practice around the country. Many people talk about organisational injustice as the hazard. Victoria, I think, has procedural injustice. And it was particularly around the amount of communication that they had. It was also around the removal of them from their role and not being given suitable duties. I know one organisation where they give you suitable alternate duties, otherwise known as SAD. So very appropriate. And the other issue was the length of time in which it took for them to conduct the investigation. And one of the reasons that the Department of Education appealed this was they said this is a single case and you can't make generalised conclusions in relation to a single case. And they gave what they thought were extenuating circumstances, I think, with special pleading about why it took so long. But within the report, they were asked to give how many investigations they had outstanding and how long they'd been going for. So they had 606 active investigations going. 245 of them had been going for less than 6 months, but 25% of them have been going over a year. And so out of that 646 have been going for over 2 years. So we're dealing with actually a systemic issue here. And this is what the Industrial Relations Commission was able to flesh out and then publish. So we can see all of that dirty linen. And one of the other special pleadings that the Department of Education gave was, well, you've got to understand that our investigations are very complex. And they listed about a dozen different agencies at times they may have to consult with. And New South Wales Police, Children's Guardian, Independent Commission Against Corruption, the Ombudsman, Environmental Protection Authority, Department of Communities and Justice, NESA, the Education Standards Authority, Safe Work, Public Service Association. Now, whether or not they actually ended up having to work with those people in this particular investigation, I can't find in the finding, but it was put out there and almost arguing against themselves, going, you can't argue in this case that we have a generalised problem, and yet saying generally we have very complex investigations, and therefore that's why you must understand this, that this is not a breach and it was acceptable. And so you've got a bit of doublespeak going on as they try to defend their own position. So you can see a couple of things. The overall length of investigations is quite long, and the argument of complexity doesn't fly.
So from the notes in this case, you know, it does seem like something deeper might be at play here. Like you say, this isn't just one investigation that had a poor impact on a person. This seems to be more a systemic issue. So what kind of gives it away from the notes on this case?
I think what's interesting, and you've got to dig a little bit. One of the reasons, another reason they say not just the reason that things are complex is the amount of agents that you have to work with, but the particular elements within the organisation. And one of their list is the psychosocial risks to investigators. Now, to me, that's an invitation for someone to make a complaint about the psychosocial risk to investigators. So I did a little bit of digging and looking through parliamentary records in New South Wales. What we can see in 2022, there were 70 investigators in their internal, in the Education Standards Investigation Unit, whatever they're called. But by 2024, there were only 50. So you start to go, is the psychosocial risk for investigators their workload? Do we actually need to dig deeper into the Department of Education now that they've told us that there's a psychosocial risk, a high chance of psychosocial risk, and when the figures actually say that you've lost many, many people within your unit, which then again may speak to leadership and morale and other issues. I want to ask, have we got cascading psychosocial risks in this particular case. So let's not blame the investigators for doing a shoddy job. Let's have a look at the workloads that they're doing. So if you think about it, and if you're looking into the details, which I did, there were 4,500 complaints in 2024. Let's say there's 52 investigators at that stage. That's 87 reports per investigator per year. And a lot of the people are actually, therefore, got an ongoing caseload of probably 10 or 11 cases that they're going through at any one time. And so an interesting element to it when you dig into it is that there's a cascading psychosocial risk. I think one of the other ones in terms of the justice issue is, now it's mentioned only once in the report about when they discussed why this particular person was not placed in roles commensurate with their training. One was because of their behavioural issues, and those are mentioned, this wandering around with a dartboard and calling someone rude in public. But another one was they couldn't go to a financial management role because there were procurement complaints. Now, nowhere else in the finding is that actually there. And procurement is one of those difficult and dangerous things that is so heavy in policy and procedure that it's almost hard not to breach procurement guidelines in one way or another. But it has this feeling of, it used to be known back in the old days of policing as loading someone up. Okay, well, we've got you for this, let's just whack this, this, and this, and this on you. And so you had a cascading number of different things in different categories that this person who, at the time of their attempted suicide, didn't know what there was, but by the time they got to July, they were aware that there were numerous categories and they were fighting this front on different cases. This case on a number of different fronts, and perhaps not knowing where to look with it. And so you've got issues of procedural justice, relational justice as well, being cut off from people. And relational justice didn't really focus in on this finding that I could find. But I know what particularly happens is you are cut off from your peers in these investigations. I know working in an ambulance agency, when paramedics are investigated, they're told, you're under investigation and you may not talk to anyone in the workplace about it. Now, I get that from a very clear legal sense of confidentiality and allowing investigation to run its course, and what a wonderful excuse it is for politicians to say, I can't comment that because there's an ongoing investigation. But people come into things like the emergency services and in the military because there's a great camaraderie and culture there. In fact, that is what is sold at recruitment. You're joining a family. And so at the very point of investigation, that family that was put forward to you at your recruitment, you're now told you can't have their support. And this is another thing that the Department of Education argued. They said, but we told them we had an EAP and they can do all these things. And so an EAP is not sufficient. You know that phrase, it's the least that we could do? It sometimes feels like an EAP is. It's the least that we could do. And so there's a cascading, interweaving number of issues there that it takes some time to unstitch and to rebuild something better in the way in which we investigate.
So I'm interested in the wider context. So obviously there's a lot of focus on this particular case and suicide, but the improvement notice was against the whole department, right, and their investigations. So I'm interested in that wider context and how it was extrapolated out.
Within the finding?
Yeah.
I think what you can see is they made all kinds of allegations against the inspector, that they didn't have a reasonable cause to believe. That's not the actual cause they used, but that's what I recognise in policing, that they didn't have a subjective belief that this was the case and that they couldn't have formed that. And they were unsuccessful in saying that, largely because the evidence came out of how many investigations there were that were outstanding for such a long period of time. So the improvement notice was upheld. And so one of the interesting things with respect to the idiosyncratic responses of individuals in relation to disciplinary investigation, the code, they go on to say, says there may be individual differences in how people perceive and respond to the same psychosocial hazards, just as there are physical hazards. But that wasn't seen as an excuse for why they hadn't addressed this particular issue and the issue much more generally to improve their processes. So even the fact that one person may have been able to sustain themselves in this is not an excuse for the impact of this other particular person. It is a hazard, and people interact with it differently, and they need to account for different people's vulnerabilities and exposure to these. And so you get these individual vulnerabilities. It's almost an individual vulnerability argument. This person was uniquely vulnerable and we can't be responsible for everyone. But that's noted. That's noted in the codes. And you do need to build a system that deals with people who have idiosyncratic elements. And this has been the case in a number of different places. I know one of the local health districts around here, systemic bullying and lack of organisational justice, again seeing suicide as one of the outcomes of the investigation. You can't just go, we can't control for everyone. You have to have a system that even takes that into account. And the process for that, the finding isn't particularly clear. But here is where I think, on one way or another with trauma-informed investigations, but recognising that we can't just leave someone floating. And in this particular case, the person attempted suicide the day that they were notified that there were allegations. And yet still there's no sense that there was a level of support for that particular person, given the seriousness of their reaction to the allegations, some of which were upheld, but not all of them. And it dragged on for 11 months and probably only concluded as a result of the fact that there was a safe work investigation.
Do you need more psych health and safety in your life? Then head over to the Flourish DX Academy for several free on-demand e-learning courses. If you're an internal professional, follow Flourish DX on Eventbrite to register for any of our free fortnightly interactive webinars. Our flagship professional practice program is also exclusively available for internal professionals. The 12-week course blends theory, applied practice, and interaction with other professionals through live lectures and a monthly community of practice session. Find out more about all these learning opportunities or inquire about a bespoke in-house training at the Flourish DX Academy. www.45003.org. Now back to this episode.
It's such a strange approach to take, right? Like if we have a trip hazard there and one person walks around it and somebody else trips over it and breaks their wrist, there's no argument there that, oh, well, it's an idiosyncratic response to a hazard that somebody didn't notice it and tripped over it. Like it's a hazard. Whether you can notice it and avoid it or not, it's still a hazard that needs to be managed. It's just such a strange way to try to frame things.
Yeah.
And the person, like at the time of the notice, they just received a letter, didn't they? Like it wasn't even anybody actually had a conversation with them about what was happening and kind of advised them in person about, this is the situation and this is what's happening and this is what's going to happen next. They just got the letter, didn't they, that kind of said, there's been allegations against you and we're putting you on alternate duties.
Yes, it just says they were advised in correspondence, which is a lovely way of obscuring the actual mechanism. But I would think advised in correspondence doesn't say they were actually treated like a human being.
Like, can you imagine that? Just you open an email and yeah.
Yeah.
It's rough. All right, let's talk about the legal and philosophical elements of this then, Mark.
Now, I'm not a legal expert, but there are particular issues about, well, what is justice? what are the elements of justice? And I think perhaps here there's room for growth and maturing in the way we see this hazard and the way we understand it. One of the issues that mainly comes up is procedural justice. Is this playing out properly? Are they doing due process? Are they informing people of what is justice clear and open? Is there a transparency that's going on there? Is there a timeliness to it? These are also elements of what we might call the rule of law, that it's not just laws that are important and policies and procedures, it's the way in which those are enacted as well. So we need to consider that element, the procedural justice. And I think one of those, and I believe it fits under procedural justice, is this idea of the role of the people prosecuting it, of what could be known as a mortal litigant standard, that you won't fight them like David and Goliath. Bad example because David won, but that you won't come as a multinational government with all of its resources who can crush the small person who has no resources at their disposal in the manner you do, and that you should actually limit the amount in which you do things. Now, we don't see that kind of maturity in the codes at this stage. I think it will come, but this ability to crush people. And that then also just becomes, perhaps we need to think about the way we're perceiving procedural justice as well. In one of the, I think it's Victoria, talks about a lack of policy. One of the things that the Department of Education is not missing is layers of policy. And you can go back and the philosophers will talk lots about this, where laws increase, injustice increases. Tacitus is, Cicero is saying something like that, going, the more laws, the more injustice. And what we see in this procedural justice is that these things can be weaponized. And it's quite easy to see, and it will be interesting to see how these complaints start to change when it is recognised that systems are used against people. The massive bank of policy that needs a team of lawyers within a professional standards unit that can bamboozle people. And I defy you, if you work in the public service at any level, that you can obey all of the laws and policies and procedures. I got an email just this morning from one department giving another 8 policies and procedures. And a way that I think this has come out particularly clearly is from the Royal Commission into Veteran and Defence Suicide. There's 122 recommendations that came from it. One of the interesting things that the Commissioner said within the findings, the general findings, was that the problem with the ADF is not that they don't have policies and procedures to do these things, it's just that they don't do them. And they've had so many inquiries, and the problem with inquiries is not the recommendations, it's that the ADF just don't enact them. But there are 122 recommendations for the military. None of them have to do with trauma exposure, which is what we automatically think about with the well-being and suicide of veterans, about combat fatigue and that kind of thing. It reads like a shopping list of psychosocial risk mitigation. It has to do with removing bullying and harassment, including sexual. I think it's the second greatest number of recommendations in the Royal Commission have to do with not hiring and then covering over sexual predators. Mm. Now, can we put that into a psychosocial risk framework? Absolutely. Harassment, including sexual harassment, is not appropriate in the workplace, and yet it was allowed to continue. But one really interesting submission to the Royal Commission was by Ben Wadham and his team, and talked about administrative violence. And administrative violence is when those systems really are used against people, when they're weaponized. And so this procedural justice is really important for us to be able to understand that actually sometimes it's not that we have a lack of systems, it's that the systems are now weaponized, particularly in large government organisations. And it's interesting to see what's playing out with Atlassian at the moment as well, in a live court case, which I don't know if we can comment because there's an ongoing court case about it, but someone was sacked for being rude to the boss, essentially. But she was the only one.
The only one who was sacked, not the only one who was rude. Yeah.
Yes.
Was she the only one that was female?
That I don't know.
If I had to sack someone every time they were rude to me, I wouldn't have any employees.
It's true, Jason. Yeah.
But what was interesting most recently in investigation, if I can sideline to Atlassian and probably get myself sued and drag you guys along with me, when they announced that they were sacking 1,600 workers, the senior leader of the organisation did a town hall and said, this has been a really tough day. I want to acknowledge that. It's been really tough for the company and really tough for me. I went, are you completely tone deaf? You've just impacted the livelihood of 1,600 people, and you're concerned about how tough it's been to you to do it. And the essence of the complaint, of the rude comment that made, was this particular person in the US said, oh, are you actually doing this from the locker room at the Utah Jazz that you own with your billions of dollars? And that was taken offense at. But what we can see is this cascading element. I think there's a tone deafness in some of the executive to be able to understand what procedural justice is and to be able to enact that in a way rather than weaponizing the extensive systems that they have to actually have the chance to moderate those, to simplify those. And we know that the ever-growing increase of regulation and policy increases your ability to be able to be found in the wrong, but it's not being seen by the courts as being good enough. You actually need to be doing things rather than just creating policies about things and then staffing and resourcing it properly. The procedural justice perhaps is an issue of workload for investigators, but that never came up in the finding.
So I'm interested, Mark, we're talking about, investigations gone wrong, but underneath that, obviously that organisational injustice. From your experience and research, what is some of the harm that can occur when this organisational injustice does occur?
So the kinds of things that can occur is obviously suicidality was particularly the case here, and we've seen in veterans and defence. But one of the ones in which I'm arguing when I'm in the UK and in my book is this idea of moral injury and betrayal. That particularly in an organisation, say like the Department of Education, where it is a very morally upright organisation, you get to do good things, you get to teach young children. And the sense of betrayal is deep. And the research on this idea of moral injury, loss of worldview, loss of sense of self and of justice and fairness, when we start to lose these larger existential categories in our life as a result of work, particularly altruistic, government, philanthropic, good organisations, we feel this deep sense of betrayal and actually like the entire carpet of our moral universe has been pulled out from underneath us. And when that occurs, these are deep wounds. And I worry sometimes that people see psychosocial hazards like they see physical hazards. You mentioned trip hazards before, Joelle. I think the impact from organisational betrayal has a deeper existential element to it than perhaps a trip hazard.
Oh, absolutely. And I think, if we look at an outcome like a post-traumatic stress disorder, as a consequence of moral injury, that is in some cases, I would argue, as impactful as like an amputation injury or something like that in terms of impact on your life, impact on your career prospects, your ability to function in the world.
Yeah. And it's really interacting in that return to workspace. One of the concepts I used in my doctoral research was this one of perceived injustice that comes from the world of motor vehicle accidents and industrial accidents when you get a significant physical injury. If you perceive that is a result of someone else's negligence, but also an injustice has occurred, it takes you longer to heal physically. That we are, I would say, fearfully and wonderfully made, or whether we are complex beings, that when even a trip hazard can be the sense of betrayal, particularly when you fall into the return to work cycle and the insurance cycle, when those things don't work and you're seen as negligent. And here, I guess, goes to a deeper issue of one of the things I advocate. If organisational injustice is the problem, then we need to inculcate a set of behaviours or even a culture that is just, that is fair. And what does a just culture look like? And I think there's some really good answers, and some industries do really well in changing the game. And here's a larger issue. The causes can be moral injury, but what we have is a very fear-based investigative framework from everywhere from the regulator down, from the regulator to the internal investigation units. The questions are usually what policy was breached by whom and how do we punish them? And we don't get an open culture that takes a systems and a workplace look at it and goes, what was the workplace environment in which this occurred? How did that contribute to the actions of that particular person and what they believed this position would be? Why then did they respond in that particular way to that environment? How do we then change the environment in a way that actually stops them from doing that? So I don't know in the investigation of this person in the Department of Education if any systemic thing was taken to look at why did they behave in that way? Why did they possibly breach procurement? We don't tend to take a systems approach to it. And we don't have a learning environment. And when we come with blame, automatically people close up and people are fearful. And organisations are fearful of their reputation being harmed. Regulators want to ensure that they will be seen as being competent in front of people, and a good way to do that is to show who they've found is in the wrong. The Auditor General of New South Wales has just significantly questioned whether or not Safe Work New South Wales is actually being effective in its enforcement. Auditor General they do the best reports on these workplace things because they haven't drunk the Kool-Aid. They come at it coolly and clinically. And so it's worth us thinking deeper and philosophically about that psychosocial safety climate, as well as the culture that is there. Now, culture, we could argue to toss, and had a bit of this back and forth with Rob Briner, who I know is a friend of the show. And I like what he's onto. We tend to blame culture. Well, culture is a set of entrenched behaviours. Those go back and forward. Why call it culture at all? It's a set of entrenched behaviours. I would say that it's also entrenched beliefs about the way the organisation works. And so when you start to get into this belief stuff, and this has been a convoluted way to get back to moral injury, when we have these deeply held beliefs about the way the organisation should work, and we see that it works the other way, and that the investigation into them is actually working, it's not broken, it's working as designed to be overly complex and convoluted and to keep people out of the ability to be able to answer coherently to those allegations with the hope that your organisation will have your back and go, this is what we've learned and how we'll be better tomorrow than we were yesterday.
Yeah, and there's so many lessons there, I think, that, we can learn from where safety has gone before, right? And safety as a domain, I guess, of knowledge has certainly learned about the importance of those kind of blame-free investigations to actually understand the broader how something happened as a means of learning from it and improving from it, but also, really recognizing that to be able to do that well, you need to be kind of the role of the sort of the independent investigator who's actually separate from the organisation, separate from the regulator as well, where their role is actually to understand what happened and share the learnings from it. So, yeah, there's definitely a lot, I think, that industrial relations approaches could learn from what safety has learned over the past 50 years or so.
And that's possibly a change on this bigger philosophical / legal way of thinking about these work health and safety issues, is moving from an adversarial framework. And lots of the investigators who work for these organisations are former police officers when that's their job, to be adversarial, or the legal system is. But what about inquisitorial, much like a coroner's report? Where you go, what caused this? They don't necessarily want to know who did it. Mm-hmm. They want to know what were the circumstances that led to it, and actually perhaps a little bit of a revelation that we change from a much more adversarial to an inquisitorial, which is a way we could operationalise much better the way in which we do these investigations. And a trauma-informed principle, but I think it's a fair principle in procedural justice, is to allow a person to have their say. In my research, I had a paramedic who performed the first on-site amputation in a motor vehicle accident in their jurisdiction. Terrible scene, difficult, stressful in every single way. Eventually a complaint was made about him, an investigation was undertaken, and he was never consulted. He was never allowed to give his say. And they found the allegation to be unsubstantiated. And the first phone call he got was them telling him, after being under investigation for a number of months, is, we want to give you a commendation for your good work. Now, we've got to say this just culture framework is, how do we allow both the person to give their account, not just be held accountable? How do we recognise former good service and go, actually, this is really out of character for this person? And that would help us answer a number of these things. I think the regulator needs to change. I think many regulators love to tell stories on their web pages of who they've punished and how much they got fined. And in fact, I challenged a regulator one day and said, you don't do this well. And they said, no, we use the carrot and the stick. I said, well, I'm on your web page, homepage now, and there's 22 investigations that you've got reported here, and 21 of them say how much you fined people, but not the lessons learned. And so you get a roll down to corporate leaders who are having to comply to that kind of environment and culture and set of expectations that are, I think, patently unjust. And they're responding, and if I can use one swear word in your podcast, shit rolls downhill. That goes down to that next layer as well. And so what we find is that they're trying to blame people. Now, we know that a lot of industries are required to have a certain amount of investigations into things. So aged care, for instance, if you don't have a number of investigations that you've done, they'll go, you're not actually doing your job properly, and fair enough. But if you have too many, you get in trouble. So the managers are trying to balance not getting in trouble from the regulator for not having enough people that they've punished, and not destroying their own workforce by punishing them all. And so how do you balance that? And then when you come into this system, it's a system absolutely soaked in a blame culture rather than a growth and a learning culture. And there is maliciousness in the workplace, but by and large, it's human error that these people are investigating. And I feel sorry for the investigators for the Department of Education, because they're massively under-resourced. And yet nowhere in the finding has that come up. And yet there's this one line acknowledgement that there's psychosocial hazards there for the investigators. Something's got to change.
I would love if regulators were able to start publishing improvement notices. I think there's so much learning for employers, for PCBUs in the content of improvement notices that, you know, once you've got to what can actually be published, which is a prosecution or an enforceable undertaking, you know, that's really once it's got past a fairly significant threshold of something has actually gone wrong. And there's so much learning opportunity that's missed because these improvement notices are sort of protected and need to be kept confidential, which is a shame, because then, you know, a lot of the time when we're talking with, you know, boards or executives of our client organisations, they're asking about, well, what are the regulators doing? And we can kind of broadly talk about the types of improvement notices that we are aware of, but without the visibility of that, it really doesn't give people a good indication of actually how much activity is going on here and what are the types of things that are being picked up. You know, what are the systems of work issues that are being identified as needing to be improved? And I think that would actually, that would be a real opportunity to improve the way that people can learn from regulators, I guess, within their existing scope, right? Because ultimately their job is to determine whether the law is being breached or complied with, and it's not really part of their job to understand the how and the why. It's, you know, is it or is it not? So there's a whole separate piece there around actually what should regulators be doing, or should there be somebody else who's doing the other bit?
Yep.
So what, in your view, should employers be sort of learning from this hearing?
I think large-scale employers have different things to learn than small. I think small organisations, startups, and, you know, just moving beyond startup need to have a good framework to be able to enact justice within. It's the arbitrariness of smaller organisations that is problematic. But for large organisations, have we gone too far? Have we muddied the waters so much with so many policies and regulations that we've become paper safe, to use Greg Smith's term, but without being actually safe environments? Have we got a set of entrenched blame cultures? I think, and there's certainly research around this, that we need to be able to have organisations that can admit blame and are held less liable as a result of being able to not protect their brand in the first instance. And we need to keep PR as far away from this as possible and brand protection out of it. So that policy piece, it's that piece about, have we got too much? There needs to be a much greater sensitivity to the individual. So this person attempted suicide, and there was no evidence given that I saw about what support networks were given other than EAP. They were removed from their peers, and they were told you can call a 1-800 number. That's not good enough. It shouldn't fly. Now, maybe they were given other things as well that weren't covered in that, so let's hope that occurred. But then to wait 3 months after someone is under that significant stress, not even to name the allegations, if you can get to the point of standing someone down and then investigating, have you even got a prima facie case at that point when you tell them you're under investigation? At what point can you tell them that? You need to think about that in the way you do your internal investigations. I think that separation of powers, again, a rule of law principle. You can't be the judge, jury, and executioner all in the one person. Is there the point, and I know in Tasmania in their emergency services, they were trying to put this in, is before you make adverse findings, you actually need to look at the good record of this person and the things that they've done that have been positive, and take into account the many years of good service. I wonder if we need an ethics committee within these elements of investigative bodies within internal organisations. Once you get to the size and you've got your own investigative body, should we be proceeding Now, people who have done research know that ethics committees have a broad range of people. They have someone from a legal background, someone from a research background. I've sat on one as a pastor to go, hang on, we need to care for people here. Now, I know of one organisation, they had gathered the data about whether or not someone was likely to be using, it was an ambulance organisation, be using narcotic drugs because they could look at how much that they had prescribed or used within there. And there was an algorithm that goes, this person is a person of high likelihood. I had someone within that group come to me quite distressed and go, we need someone to actually go, well, what are the things causing them to get into this? And again, there was a case within New South Wales Ambulance where they were fined a significant amount of money because they didn't have proper drug handling systems. So they had a systems error. But it's come out in the media that they accused this person of coming into a meeting with their manager with 2 vials containing a drug, saying, yes, you've got me. And then after his suicide, recanting on that allegation. And so we need to have a much more, I would argue, pastoral heart for the people that we have, because we're destroying and burning good people because an allegation has not yet been tested, and we give them 6 months in purgatory or a year, or if you're those 44 people within Department of Education in New South Wales, over 24 months. That's hardly acceptable. And I think when these are resolved, and they're resolved showing that no one was found to be guilty, that the allegations didn't stick, we can't just put non-disclosure agreements on this. This is what's going on in some of these cases that I've mentioned before, that they've been offered non-disclosure agreements and non-disparaging agreements so that they can cover over the fact that they were falsely accused or falsely removed from their duties, which creates a climate of there's no responsibility here. And I'd like to see the number of non-disclosure agreements that an organisation does have to be publicly published. Why not do that? That might actually start to change cultures. Because I know multiple investigations into volunteer fire agencies across Australia, and they're an interesting case. The Productivity Commission is saying we don't know if we have enough volunteer firefighters moving forward in Australia because they've just been dropping every year since at least 2012, and the figures are quite startling. A friend who's done Churchill Fellowship into the cultures of these organisations, and they're covering up, systemic covering up of essentially psychosocial risks. And these only get exposed in a mea culpa moment when the weight of evidence is so large that their denials no longer fly, and they have to do something about it. But what we get is we get a pressure cooker situation covered over by non-disclosure agreements and long wait times that people in the investigative cycle find themselves. And if we can start to publish those non-disclosure agreements, we start to have mea culpa moments much earlier. Why have you issued 300 non-disclosure agreements this year? What are we hiding? And it's by and large not good for the individual. It's good for the reputation of our good organisations. So too much policy, too little policy. See what size and maturity your organisation is. EAP is insufficient. Don't think it's a psychosocial risk mitigation strategy. It just isn't. It's not a sufficient one anyway. Look at cultural issues, and particularly the culture of blame, and switch to a learning culture rather than a blame culture. What have we learned? And there is good evidence from the medical world. If you admit error early and say we're making steps to make sure it doesn't happen again, then what we find is they're less likely to have litigation come against them. So that ability to short circuit the mea culpa moment is particularly important. That removal of non-disclosure agreements, seeing things as pastoral and ethical issues, not just legal, and to be able to get people to work together on that within those organisations is important, I think. And individual cases, quite often, you have to be aware for the idiosyncratic elements of every single person. Why does someone trip on that hazard and another person doesn't? You have to engineer for all of those. The same with psychosocial hazards is my belief here. And we can't get everyone. But what's your collaboration process to design these? And I think not only are these processes up here too many, too numerous, they're not done in collaboration, and they're not truly the reviewed open documents that I think is required by law, that they're an ongoing, improving, reviewed, collaborative. Don't consult people, collaborate with people. And that's what we're trying to design in this disaster recovery chaplaincy. So the organisational justice slips into the way in which you make policies. And this is the other part of organisational justice that I don't think is addressed well enough at the moment, is substantive justice. Is this actually fair? Is this actually proportionate, the punishments that are meted out? And have you co-designed this with the people? I keep having career-limiting moments. I think I've had about 10 career-limiting moments in this podcast already.
Well, I don't think you're ever going to work for the regulator.
Of course I'm not, because they don't want to hear that. And that's the problem. They want to tell everyone else they've got the problem and not actually stand in that room full of mirrors. I'd love to work for a regulator and help them take a good, long, hard look at themselves and go, you've got to stop doing to others what they do unto other people. But a policy came out about getting reimbursements for costs, and it was for volunteers who have been giving lots and lots of time, and it ended with a threat. If you don't get this right, we're going to remove you from service and possibly punish you. And you're like, this is the first time I've seen this document. You really want to finish with a threat? And that's the way our policy tends to be done, because it's done all the way down. And it's entrenched in our media, and it's entrenched in, and you've just said it in, at the very start of this podcast, it's a cultural milieu that we're in. We don't want to understand. And this cultural moment is so significant and important that we don't understand, and we don't want to understand the other person's point of view. And it's what's seeped into our safe work system, has been marinating in this culture.
Mark, I think we'll leave it there. I think that's been a really great discussion, and the deepest discussion I think I've ever had on an organisational justice or injustice. So we thank you for that. And I think you've given some really practical takeaways, particularly for large organisations, around how they can build more justice into particularly, thinking about investigations processes as well. So thank you for that. But I don't want to let you off the hook. There's two last questions that we always ask at the end of each podcast. Can't remember how you answered this 4 years ago, but what are your hopes for the future of workplace mental health?
More curiosity and kindness. That we don't just go for the simplistic explanation of this, but what was the policy that was breached by whom, and how do we punish them? What have we learned? How do we grow? How do even people who have done the wrong thing, people who have done stupid things, like put people's face on a dartboard, how do we not descend to that level in our investigative system and worse? Why can't we have curiosity and kindness, not just crushing blame? That's what I would hope for workplace mental health and safety, that the medium is the message, that we can create kind of workplace health systems that aren't so feared and so punitive, but are seen as a joy for people.
That's a high aspiration, but we'll put it out there into the universe.
Sure is. Yeah. All right. Words of advice, Mark, for listeners who are interested in working in this field.
I think it's vital. I think if you want to be involved, find your niche and your unique voice that you've got to offer and research it, not just anecdotally, although that's really good, but research and have that curiosity again. to want the best for people. Forget about the title of manager, director, executive director. Those are ultimately meaningless titles that people seem to seek after. Do it because it's good for people and it'll be good for you. A book I've just been reading, Compassionomics. If you show compassion to people, if you have empathy for them, they have much better results in the medical world, physical results. But you know what's even better? Doctors who show compassion burn out less. It's good for the bottom line. Let's be compassionate and empathetic. Let's actually seek to truly understand people and the context that they're in, and then do something mutually to improve. And so that requires internal heart change each of us. And I can't change everyone else, but I can change me. So work on yourself, be curious, be kind, and be willing to change.
Thank you, Mark.
Words of wisdom.
Yes.
From the Reverend Doctor.
From the Reverend Doctor.
All right, Mark, pleasure having you on, mate. We'll put a link definitely to your book so that people can find it on Amazon and wherever good books are sold. But yeah, thank you for joining us again, and hopefully it's not another 4 years before you're on the podcast again.
No, thanks for having me. Cheers.
All right, listeners, that brings us to the end of this episode. Remember, we do record these over video with our guests, and you can catch all of our previous videos on the Flourish DX YouTube channel. We also take snippets of these videos and put them on the Flourish DX LinkedIn page. If you haven't already, follow along there, and you can always connect with Joelle, myself, and Mark if you want to continue the conversation on this particular topic. So thanks again, listeners. We'll catch you next episode.
You've been listening to the Psych Health and Safety Podcast. To stay up to date with the latest on psychological injury prevention, follow Flourish DX on LinkedIn and subscribe to the Psych Health and Safety Podcast at www.psychealthandsafety.com.